Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Evan Medeiros. I'm the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Professor Fiona Cunningham from UPenn, the University of Pennsylvania, to talk about her new book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security. So I've known Fiona for many, many years, and so it's a real pleasure to have her speak about her book here today. This event is being sponsored by the U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues under the international programs here at Georgetown and also Asian Studies within the School of Foreign Service. This is part of a regular series of lectures we do where we convene a group of experts or bring in particularly distinguished scholars to talk about their new research and some of the most interesting topics that are going on in China and in U.S.-China relations. For the past year or so, the U.S. Defense Department has been, through its annual China Military Power Report, has been talking about how China may quadruple, if not quintuple, the size of its nuclear arsenal. There was a recent Defense Intelligence Agency report just released, I don't know, about a week ago or so, Fiona, that actually omitted the line about China quintupling its nuclear force by 2035. So this is a very, very dynamic area. As a longtime scholar of Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations, one of the most interesting things about the U.S.-China relationship is how, for most of the history of the relationship, nuclear weapons have been in the background, way in the background. Very, very different than the U.S.-Soviet experience during the Cold War. And now that the Chinese appear to be on the moving towards expanding their nuclear arsenal, it's sort of raising a whole series of questions. So that's why we invited Fiona, because she's going to open the aperture for us. Her book makes this very, very interesting argument that China has actually decided to rely on offensive cyber operations, CounterSpace capabilities, and precision conventional missiles to coerce its adversaries, actually substituting for a greater reliance on nuclear weapons. And so it would be really interesting to hear not only her new research, which I know has some really interesting, excellent sourcing from Chinese sources, but also to hear she's written quite a bit about Chinese nuclear weapons and what motivates China, even though that's actually not specifically what the book focuses on. So Fiona, thank you so much for coming down to Georgetown and visiting us. It's a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours. Maybe if you can talk for, 20, 30 minutes or so.
Sure.
Whatever is necessary to summarize your book, and then we can, I'll ask you a few questions, and then we'll open it to the audience.
That sounds fabulous. Okay, well, I'm going to pick up this, make sure it is the clicker, make sure that it's switched on. But I just also want to start by thanking you, Evan, for inviting me here today, to thank all of the Georgetown staff who've been involved in bringing me here to Georgetown, but it's a real pleasure to be back here. It's also really exciting to talk about my book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security, and I have to be careful to remember the title, because this, as many of you, as you will come to write books or encounter the book writing process, will know that whatever the title started as is not usually what it ends as. But it's going to be published by Princeton University on January the 7th of 2025. So I'm going to, okay, great, we're in business. Spend about 20-25 minutes offering you a bit of a walkthrough of what the book is about and why you should read it. So I won't be telling you everything about it, but hopefully giving you a sense of what it is about so that you can decide whether or not you want to read the whole way through or just particular chapters. So the first thing I'm going to do is to talk through the big sort of central question of the book, which I call the limited war dilemma. I'm then going to touch on two of the kind of core ideas in the book, which is strategic substitution and information age weapons. The next thing I'm going to do is give you a brief taste of what my theory of strategic substitution is. As a political science book, it has a theoretical contribution in that manner. Then I will talk through the research design and the sources, the original Chinese language sources and interviews that I've been using to write the empirical chapters. And then rather than going through and walking, through the academic argument of every single chapter, I'm going to tell you something that I think is interesting or novel that I found in every one of the empirical chapters. So looking at China's nuclear decision-making about its conventional missile capability, offensive cyber operations, and counterspace. Then I'm going to conclude with a bit of an evaluation of how China's decision to engage in strategic substitution is looking after it's been doing this for a number of years, and close with some implications that are going to focus on US-China relations given the nature of this particular program. So to begin with, this book is about how states cope with the dilemma that nuclear weapons have basically created for all countries that want to still use military capabilities to coerce their adversaries. And that is how can they do that without triggering a catastrophic nuclear war. And specifically in the case of China, how can they do that if they haven't followed the pathway that other states have taken in their ways of coping with this particular dilemma? So most states have done what the United States has done, represented by our carrier strike group on the left-hand side of the screen there, which is to build up conventional military capabilities that can deliver a decisive conventional victory. Other states like Pakistan and Russia have relied much more on threats of nuclear first use to escalate a conflict as their way of trying to get leverage out of their military capabilities. But China doesn't appear to take either approaches, which has led, I think, to a lot of speculation and scrutiny on its nuclear strategy to see if there's like a secret first-use nuclear policy hiding in there somewhere. And so what I argue in this book is that instead China has taken a third approach, which I call strategic substitution, which is represented by a nice power outage over the island of Manhattan, which I hope will give you a sense of what a large-scale cyber attack on US critical infrastructure might look like.
That's dark, Fiona.
It is quite literally dark as well as like metaphorically dark. So
maybe Philadelphia instead of Manhattan?
It just doesn't have the kind of like mass.
Capture the imagination.
I will just pause for 1 second and just say one of the things that is always tricky about presenting, which I will show you in the next slide as well, is images of what these kinds of capabilities would look like in their effects. So I guess it was a power outage for some natural reason that left Manhattan in the dark. But Philadelphia, maybe next time I'll see what I can find.
Sounds good.
But strategic substitution basically involves threatening to use non-nuclear weapons that can have strategic effects and pairing these escalatory uses of non-nuclear weapons with a nuclear posture that threatens nuclear weapons use in retaliation for a nuclear attack only. And this combination enables a country basically to manipulate the risk of escalation, including up to the nuclear level, without actually having to make nuclear threats. And this is significant because when two countries find themselves deep in mutual vulnerability with another nuclear-armed adversary, it can be very difficult to make credible nuclear threats. And in fact, what strategic substitution does is it actually places the burden instead on the adversary to be the one that crosses the nuclear threshold and uses nuclear weapons in response to these non-nuclear provocations. And so this kind of approach promises to serve as a substitute for these traditional options of threatening nuclear first use or threatening a decisive conventional victory. So I argue in the book that China chose to gamble on this approach for two reasons, because it's unproven. No other country has kind of gone down this pathway. The first is because the capabilities that it developed to deal with its military problems during the Cold War didn't really thumb the scales in favor of either the nuclear first use option or the decisive conventional victory option. And second is that whenever China was looking to kind of increase its capabilities to coerce its adversaries, it was prioritizing the speed and credibility of the leverage it could sort of attain. And these types of priorities of speed and credibility favor information age weapons over the traditional options, which I'll talk through a little bit more in the next slide.
Fiona, can I ask you, did you find explicit Chinese sources, presumably military thinkers, that A, actually identified the limited war dilemma that you mentioned, and B, the fact that these different strategic capabilities were a good substitution?
Yes, I did. So I can explain a little bit on sort of both counts. I think that throughout the 1990s, a lot of Chinese decision makers, whether they were defense planners like Zhu Guangya, who was a very famous nuclear scientist, pushed forward China's neutron bomb program, but also then became a top sort of advisor on how China would engage in its sort of military equipment. But Zhu Guangya essentially said in sort of the mid-1990s that we've got this problem with the kind of evolution of military technology over time, where weapons are becoming more and more and more destructive, and that also makes them less usable. And so we're starting to see instead countries look to rely much more on precision technologies, information technologies, things that if you pair them together with sort of political and diplomatic activities can help you to exert leverage that becomes really hard to do when you're essentially trying to otherwise threaten catastrophe through the use of nuclear weapons. And one sees this attitude not just in people like Zhu Guangya, but also in some of China's top military thinkers as well in the Academy of Military Sciences. Eventually, Jiang Zemin himself in a speech in 2002 sort of indicates that China needs to integrate these different elements of strategic deterrence together to get them sort of working in concert. In terms of the sort of substitution logic, one also sees in the Chinese sources frequently sort of comparisons between the credibility of nuclear weapons and what's called information deterrence, as well as nuclear deterrence and space deterrence. And so I'll talk about this a little later in the presentation too, as being more flexible, being more credible, it doesn't lead to the loss of life. And finally, on the conventional missile force, very explicitly talking about the differences between what conventional missiles can do versus nuclear missiles can do, even when they're housed in exactly the same organization. So the logic is sort of there in the sources themselves as well.
And how hard is it to sort of get access to these sources, right? In the China studies field, I mean, the PLA may write a lot, but probably access to it is limited. Can you say a little bit about how you actually conducted this research?
Yeah, sure. Actually, do you mind if I'm going to skip ahead to a slide and let's look at the sources. So I had the great privilege when I was in graduate school of spending well over a year doing field work in China. I had my IRB protocol in place, and I had the privilege of being able to interview about 50 Chinese strategists. Sometimes I interviewed them more than once, and that provided both validation of my theoretical claims about what information age weapons could do for China's or any country's strategic deterrence posture. And it also helped to provide some context for the empirics, so understanding what was driving Chinese decision making at different points in time. But the place where I'm really able to sort of pinpoint when China made decisions and why come from written sources. And those written sources, some of them you can get here in the United States and some are either much easier or only available in China. And so I was collecting a whole lot of written sources that include, we have here on the right-hand side, chronologies of one of China's top military decision makers, Liu Huaqing, that talks a lot about sort of the decision-making of defense planning in the late 1990s. In the center is a copy of World Military Review, which is one of the publications of China's Academy of Military Sciences, and World Military Review will sort of look at what's going on in other countries' military affairs, pull out what the implications are for China, and so it's a way of sort of gauging what kinds of capabilities other countries are developing and how China is sort of processing and understanding the limits and the advantages of those capabilities. On the left-hand side is another type of important source that I'm using, which is biographies that are put forward, this one in the case by the General Armaments Department, political department, I believe, in which they will basically go through and give a sort of biography that's based on sources that we can't reach, archival sources that are designed to give you a sense of the life of a particular individual and the kinds of decisions that they were making. And so this one on the left in particular was really useful for thinking about things like China's CounterSpace decision making, China's thinking about developing certain types of nuclear capabilities as well, given Zhu Guangya's role in doing things like basically running operations at China's nuclear test base at the time of the of the negotiations over the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1996. So it is difficult to do this kind of work. I pored over, I would say, hundreds of sources, and I can now count them in the bibliography that made it into the final version. And I think I would also emphasize that it's really difficult to do this kind of work today because the research environment in China is a little bit more difficult. Source availability is also more difficult because people are writing less within China about some of these issues.
So you were probably doing this, what, about 10 years ago or so?
A little bit less. So I began the field work in 2015 and concluded it in 2017, but I continued to collect as many written materials as I could after that period of time. And I was able to go back to China for other field work in the last year.
And do you think you can still do this kind of work in China? How do you, as a member of the China Studies field, how do you think about your ability to gather written materials, get access to specialists, interview them?
So I would put it in this sense. I think that it may be more difficult to initiate a project like this and to build the networks among scholars, strategists, etc. within China today. But for anyone who has some sort of existing networks that you can use, then those networks still remain somewhat available. And I've had the opportunity to speak to some of the similar people who I spoke to when I was doing my fieldwork in China in more recent times. But I think that perhaps you would have a little bit less richness in some of these data today. I would encourage, though, if anyone is interested in doing this kind of research, it's still really, really, really important to get as close to good sources from China that give you granularity, that give you insights into what's driving the decision making, even if it's challenging. So I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it's more difficult today than it used to be. Okay, so I'm just going to run back one slide and talk you through a little bit. I'll pass on the theory because I think...
This is the School of Foreign Service. Theory.
Exactly. Theory, I mean, the theory, if you're interested, I'm very happy to talk through, but essentially this is trying to give you a sense of, just to sort of paint the picture. Some of you might hear this idea of strategic substitution and think to yourselves, wow, that sounds like a really, really, really smart idea. Some of you might be listening and thinking, that sounds ridiculous. It sounds like it's definitely not going to work. And the truth is that, like every type of answer to the limited war dilemma, even if you're threatening nuclear weapons or threatening conventional victories, none of them are silver bullets. They all have pros and cons. And so ultimately what the theory is about is essentially why you see China prioritize some factors and not others that lead it down this very different pathway to other nuclear weapon states. So I'll leave it there on the theory, but I do want to talk a little bit about what it is that, sorry, just give me one second, what the book is kind of in the book in terms of the cases. So I'm looking at every one of the decisions China made to essentially pursue these types of capabilities as substitutes since it faced this limited war dilemma from 1995 when the United States and China had their first major post-Cold War crisis during the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis. And the reason that that is kind of the starting point, if you like, of when China faced the limited war dilemma is that prior to that point, I think there was some kind of questions, there were some doubts, there was some uncertainty as to whether if there was a cross-strait war, the United States was going to come to to Taiwan's assistance. And that crisis kind of cleared up some of those doubts in the minds of China's leaders about what the most important military contingency they were going to have to face looks like. Rather than facing any old limited war on their periphery, they were going to have to prepare for a war that may involve the intervention of a nuclear power with the most significant advanced conventional military capabilities on the planet. And that is a problem for China's leaders. So China also faced, the first sort of leverage deficit I cover in the book is the Taiwan Strait crisis, but I also note that China faced additional leverage deficit in 1999 when the United States accidentally bombed China's embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo Air War. And you might be thinking, why is an accident something that's going to generate these kind of concerns within China that it's going to need more leverage? And the reason for that is to this day, China's leaders do not believe that that bombing was an accident. So instead, they saw this as a kind of signal of US hostility and a need for them to gain more leverage to stop these kinds of things from happening again in the future. But I do want to emphasize that when I look at the decision making for each one of these capabilities, I don't start from the year that China's decision makers looked like they made a choice to stand up a coercive capability, to develop doctrine, and to establish a PLA organization that would operate these weapons. I look further back into the into the past, because I want to demonstrate that prior to that point, China's leaders didn't really have a reason why they needed to go about augmenting their coercive leverage. And I also go further back in time to show that China actually often had the technology to pursue these information age weapons and use them for coercion before they actually made the decision to do so. So these choices are not just driven by the availability of technology. So moving on to the posture choices column, the next sort of thing I'm doing with the argument is to look at how China actually wrote about and organized its forces. How is it actually going to use these capabilities? And the reason this is important to the argument is that I need to demonstrate that China was primarily intending to use these capabilities for coercion, and even if it was planning to use them for warfighting too, if those two things clashed, then it was going to prioritize the coercive sort of applications. Because otherwise we could say, well, this is just part of China building up its conventional capabilities, right? There's nothing special about these capabilities.
Can I ask you on this, Fiona, how do you rule out China developing offensive cyber and CounterSpace to support China's Taiwan war plan?
Sure. So there are a couple of things that I look for in writings about China's doctrine for using these capabilities. I look at how they organize those capabilities, and I look at how they think about the transparency in signaling those capabilities to an adversary. So a couple of the things that distinguish a kind of warfighting versus a coercive use of these capabilities are that the doctrine is explicitly coercive, right? Like they say this is designed to shock and sort of frighten an adversary. It's designed to have a direct strategic effect on decision makers, in addition to, or perhaps instead of saying we're planning to do this to help us gain information dominance so we can send an invasion fleet across the Taiwan Straits. Another important thing is to look at what they're targeting. If they're targeting just military capabilities, then perhaps you can say this is a warfighting posture. But if they're also looking at targeting civilian capabilities specifically in an adversary's homeland like US critical infrastructure, not all US critical infrastructure is supporting military bases, right? So part of this is about sort of creating chaos in your adversary's homeland as a way of generating coercive leverage. It doesn't really help you win a war across the Taiwan Straits, but it might frighten the White House into tempering its decision making. I'll also note one other thing, which is the organizational structures, that if you want to be using offensive cyber or counter-space capabilities to simply enhance your warfighting capabilities, you're going to want to integrate them tightly with the joint force, so that whatever it is that your Army, your Navy, your Air Force is doing in an operation, they can take full advantage of whatever it is that cyber operations or counter-space can offer them. If instead you are trying to keep those capabilities in the hands of top decision makers so that they and they alone can make choices about when you would destroy a satellite, when you would engage in a cyber operation that's going to disable critical infrastructure in Hawaii or in Texas, then that's not very well integrated with the warfighter. So that's another reason why we might be able to sort of identify differences or trade-offs between the operational uses of these capabilities and the coercive uses. The last thing I do sort of inferentially in this book is to basically pair comparisons of these capabilities that China did pursue and use for coercive leverage to other things that could have plausibly been substitutes and that have sort of similar warfighting effects. And so I compare them with conventional bomber aircraft, electronic warfare, and special operations forces. Happy to justify those choices because there's no perfect analog to the information age capabilities China did pursue. But what these shadow cases are doing in the book is basically giving you an option to sort of look at what it does look like when China makes a choice to only pursue a capability to enhance its warfighting capabilities, but it also demonstrates that there's sometimes some contingency in why China chooses one substitute but not another. So for example, China really didn't have the aircraft technology to stand up a conventional bomber force in 1995, but it did have the technology to basically do a large conventional missile force instead. So that's one of those areas where you're like, well, you know, this is another option China could have turned to, but its aircraft technology just simply couldn't have supported that kind of a choice. It would have been pretty similar to basically just engaging in a conventional build-up in terms of the speed.
So is the idea, Fiona, that the shadow case is sort of another way to argue that the three capabilities are very, very deliberate? Because if the PLA wanted to produce a certain effect, they could have chosen bomber aircraft, but they didn't. They very deliberately chose precision conventional missiles.
Right, and similarly, if right at the beginning of China standing up its cyber forces, you would often see China actually pairing together electronic warfare and cyber operations as integrated electronic and network warfare. And over time, you see these two things separate, where you start to see cyber capabilities dealt with as a separate strategic type of capability that sits alongside nuclear or sits alongside space. And electronic warfare continues to sit in the kind of operational set of capabilities. And one of the reasons I argue that is the case is that electronic warfare lacks the range that cyber operations have. You sort of have to be proximate to the capabilities.
Aren't they a little apples and oranges? Like electronic warfare is you're going to jam somebody's radar, right? But cyber capability is I'm going to hack into their computer system and read all of their email.
But I think in the end, the sort of similarity you might draw between the two of them is essentially they're designed to try and inhibit your ability to make use of information on the battlefield. That's where they're basically going to the same operational purpose. But in the end, they can cyber can do a lot more in terms of its range, in terms of its escalatory potential than electronic warfare can. And cyber operations are not indefensible, but they are trickier to defend against than electronic warfare. So it sort of has one of these key...
And special operations forces and CounterSpace,
that's a stretch, right?
One, right? So this is like special forces in spacesuits going after American satellites?
Nope, this is like your SEAL team, right?
Okay.
So you may be wondering, like, what's the comparison here? If you're trying to think of ways in which you can disrupt your adversary's ability to make use of information on the battlefield from space, one of the things you can do is get a special operations team in somewhere to sabotage it, right? Like that's one way to get the same...
blow up a satellite ground station, for example?
Something like that, or jam, or whatever it happens to be.
I can see you had a lot of fun writing this.
I had a great time. But with special operations forces, like, I will just step back and say that trying to come up with a capability that is like a reasonable comparison with CounterSpace is particularly difficult. So SOF was kind of the best one I could come up with in this instance. And you know, when you do look at China's writings about SOF, sometimes there is, and so I'm using SOF for Special Operations Forces for short, you do sometimes see, well, you know, maybe they can have strategic effects by doing certain types of decapitation operations, etc. But when one looks at actually how China trains these forces, how it organizes them, they really do look more like a kind of ranger force rather than a SEAL force, right? They're not really designed to operate independently in small teams with delegated authorities that would allow them to do these kinds of things that could generate strategic effects. They're used much more sort of as part of China's conventional military capabilities more broadly. And one of the reasons in the end that one might look at SOF and say, why did China choose to use this set of capabilities for warfighting rather than for coercive leverage, is because if you are going to use them for these coercive strategic kind of missions, it's going to require your leaders to delegate a lot of authority to the SOF team to go and be able to do something, to not be in constant contact with you while they're hunting for Osama bin Laden or whatever it happens to be. And one of the key principles that emerges kind of inductively almost from this book, as I've written it, is that party control and the ability of top leaders to really keep a close eye on what China's military capabilities with strategic effects is really, really, really important. So that's another reason why I think that they eschewed using soft type of capabilities for something approximating coercive leverage, because China's leaders want to be able to maintain control over what their operators are doing if they can have these kinds of escalatory effects that give them leverage against China's adversaries. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the sources, which is honestly one of the most fun things in this piece. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a little bit of a taste of what is in each of these chapters. And the first empirical chapter of the book establishes these two constraints that are on China's search for leverage every time it finds itself needing more coercive leverage against an adversary. And essentially it shows that China was conventionally inferior to the US and was far, far behind, and therefore really would have taken a very long time to be able to catch up with US military capabilities. But perhaps the more important part of this chapter, and the one I spend a lot of time on, is establishing why it is that China's leaders had these doubts that making nuclear threats against their adversaries would be credible if their adversaries had nuclear weapons as well. So in this chapter, I look at three instances in which China's strategists, leaders, debated whether actually they should change their nuclear policy. Should they add conditions to nuclear no first use? Should they develop a limited deterrence capability that's going to allow them more of an escalation ladder in the nuclear era? And this quote that I have up here on the slide is taken from a part of the book that analyzes this debate that took place among China's strategists and some military officers in the early 2000s as to whether they should add conditions to the nuclear no first use policy, including if China found itself losing a conventional war over Taiwan. Now, the debate is well documented in the existing literature. Evan has written on this debate himself in ways that I cited and found very useful.
Always welcome.
In the book. But one of the less well-known features of this debate is that around the time it was taking place, the Academy of Military Sciences, China's top sort of doctrinal research body that reports to its top military decision makers, actually compiled a report for the high-level decision makers in which they basically surveyed all of China's nuclear stakeholders on what the future of China's nuclear posture should look like and what it should sort of be concerned about. And that report indicates that China was very concerned about the Bush administration, this is Bush 43 administration's investments in missile defense. They were also very concerned about the investments in very small tactical nuclear weapons. But the report said nothing about changing China's nuclear no first use policy. It recommended that China make offensive actions with its nuclear capabilities the main means, but it also recommended that China make investments in capabilities that would be able to destroy or disrupt an adversary's missile defense capabilities, specifically counter-space weapons that would be able to attack US sensors in space. The other curious thing with this report is it indicates that China should pursue a strategic dyad, so this is intercontinental range ballistic missile submarines and land-based missile forces, but also that it should develop a tactical triad at the regional level. So that is having bombers, submarines and land-based forces at the tactical level. And I'd argue that's something that we haven't really seen actually up until recently. So that decision looks like it was put on hold for a good decade.
Public document, Fiona? I mean, it sounds like a very consequential document.
Nope, it was not a public document.
This is an official Chinese document about nuclear posture.
I believe so, yes, but it is written up in the memoir of a retired Rocket Force Rocket Force commander.
Right. And is this one of these sort of super special sources that you found? So it was the memoir of a former general who ran the strategic rocket forces? Among
the special sources that I think this project brings to light.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So I will now turn to another interesting insight on the conventional missile chapter. And again, I'm not giving you the kind of this is how this chapter builds the argument, but rather here are the interesting things that this particular book is going to, I think, hopefully bring to light. So Conventional missiles are the first information age weapon that China's leaders end up pursuing, and they pursue it in the midst of the Taiwan Strait crisis. They make decisions as part of a defense component of China's 5-year plan to build up a longer range, larger and more accurate missile force. But one of the reasons they do that is that that planning process is happening concurrently with these missile tests that China's leaders basically ordered to take place to protest the fact that the United States has issued a visa to Taiwan's President Lee Teng-hui so he can come and attend a reunion here in the United States that China saw as overstepping the limits of the US's One China policy. But this raises this interesting question of, like, why did China have conventional missiles that it could go lobbing into the Taiwan Straits in the first place? And that's part of, I think, a much lesser known and more interesting story which concerns how China actually came to have conventional missiles in the first place. And this actually goes back to the late 1980s, when China's defense industry is really struggling to gain funds. They're told that they should engage in military exports to raise funds. So one of China's missile development units does so, and they line up basically military sales that are going to go to the Middle East of a short-range conventional missile. The United States then puts intense pressure on China to cancel the sale. The missiles are kind of sitting there, and they're taken advantage of by China's then nuclear-only Second Artillery Force, which is scrambling for a way to try to make itself relevant in a future in which it will only be preparing for limited wars. And they are not going to go nuclear. So one of the things its decision makers do is say, well, how about you arm us with conventional missiles? And this is a quote that's up there on the slide from, again, our missile-based commander, who eventually ended up as the deputy commander of the Second Artillery Force, in which he says, it would be our base and even the whole Second Artillery's galling shame and deep humiliation if it didn't have something to do in a Taiwan contingency. So that's a good reason to arm yourself with a set of missiles that could eventually be used. Okay, on to cyber capabilities. I think I'll start just by saying something about this image on the left-hand side. So up until about 2015, China denied that it really had any military cyber forces whatsoever. This image actually appeared in the PLA Museum in Beijing, I believe in about 2017, shows Hu Jintao, the former General Secretary, at a time when China denied it had cyber capabilities, looking over the shoulder of a PLA individual who appears to be doing something on a computer. So China pursued these offensive cyber capabilities following the bombing of its embassy in Belgrade, as I already mentioned. And there was this common judgment around that time in a lot of PLA literature that nuclear deterrence wasn't very useful because it wasn't credible, but information deterrence against a very information-dependent, as well as highly advanced adversary like the United States would be a really quick, cheap way of gaining leverage. Initially, though, China's cyber force posture is pretty kind of disorganized and haphazard, and it lacks oversight. There's a lot of kind of delegated command and control arrangements for some units in which they're doing things that maybe the central leadership is not necessarily aware of. This becomes a problem for ensuring that if China uses offensive cyber capabilities, it receives blowback, that blowback is actually going to be something that its decision makers want to absorb. And that's especially important because over the first decade of China possessing offensive cyber capabilities, they have begin with a very low level of cyber kind of usage of the internet within China and end up rapidly growing in the societal dependence on the internet. So this quote up here comes from a conference that took place right at the beginning of this period of changing China's cyber force posture from one that dialed up escalation risks to one that really calibrated them, where an officer from the Jinan Military Region headquarters basically recognizes that if you don't manage cyber capabilities properly, you're going to create really big problems for China's foreign policy writ large. And so China's leaders intervene, beginning with Hu Jintao in 2012, then Xi Jinping in 2024 sort of ends the job of imposing a much more kind of managed approach to using cyber operations on the PLA. Last piece here in terms of the capabilities I cover in the book. I actually opened the book with this dramatic anti-satellite weapons test that China engaged in 2007. If I were to think of the origins of this book, actually that may be one of the moments I remember when I was a college student reading about this anti-satellite weapons test at the breakfast table while I was on vacation in Australia. But that test followed a decision a couple of years earlier by China to essentially stand up a force posture that would threaten to use counterspace capabilities for coercive leverage. And unlike China's other two information age weapons, one of the things that it did do with its counterspace weapons that it didn't do with other capabilities is that it always envisaged that the use of counterspace capabilities should be limited. And it always planned to have this kind of calibrated approach to escalation, even before it had either the capabilities or the organizational structures that were going to be able to do so. Often the PRC sources on CounterSpace are the most explicit in their substitution logic. They talk about how space deterrence is the most flexible. It engages an adversary's military capabilities. It doesn't cause the loss of life. And this means it's much more credible and promising than using nuclear weapons. But the glimmer of hope I think that I have coming out of the space chapter is this is the one chapter where one actually sees quite explicit recognition of the inadvertent nuclear escalation risks of using some of these information age weapons, that by using them, one can inadvertently damage the components of an adversary's nuclear arsenal, which generates pressures for them to either threaten or potentially even use their nuclear weapons in response. This is, of course, a feature, not a bug, of why information age weapons are good for generating coercive leverage, but there's very little recognition of this in the Chinese language literature.
Doesn't that quote and the idea that it embodies, Fiona, doesn't that undercut your argument? I mean, are counterspace weapons really strategic substitution if they could actually trigger it, just turn out triggering a nuclear war, right? They don't keep war limited.
Sure, so I think it's a really important question because I think these are sort of matters of degree, right? So if you're threatening to use nuclear weapons, you are actually the one that crosses the nuclear threshold, and we can think of that as a sort of bright line that's quite difficult for states to do because, you know, then you are in a nuclear conflict and there's, you know, various views, but I'd say there's a decent amount of skepticism that once you use nuclear weapons, you can control any further escalation henceforth. But when you are using information age weapons, even if you are using, let's say China uses one of its anti-satellite weapons to damage one of the satellites that supports the US's either early warning system or communications with its nuclear forces, there's still a decision that the United States has to make at that point of how it responds. The nuclear posture review says quite clearly we're going to treat this as a circumstance in which we might consider using nuclear weapons. But there is still a threshold to cross, right? Is it really worthwhile triggering or using nuclear weapons in response to something that damages your nuclear capabilities, but certainly is not going to eliminate the US's nuclear arsenal? So there's this kind of additional step, and I think all of these different options for answering the limited war dilemma have some element of escalatory risk in them, and the question is just, what are you doing with that fire break between the nuclear and conventional kind of domain?
How lucky are you feeling today, sir?
Yeah, and how well do you understand your adversaries' reactions, right? How skeptical are you of their willingness to actually trigger a nuclear war or engage in a nuclear war, given what's at stake? And I think that's one of the important things to emphasize in China's calculations here, which is they probably think they care a lot more about what goes on in Taiwan than the United States. So that's a sort of tricky piece here. I will conclude with a bit of an evaluation. How has this gone for China? It's been doing this for a quarter of a century or a bit more at this point. And so there are kind of three ways that China's leaders might be coming down on this experiment or this gamble with strategic substitution. One is that this was a great success. The second is it was a catastrophic failure. The third is that it was somewhere in between. It was kind of a stopgap solution until China's conventional military modernization ended up giving it a better sort of answer to the limited war dilemma. And so if we look at the three capabilities, we can sort of, draw some rough conclusions on how well they delivered on their promise. So when it comes to conventional missiles, I think this is one of the most successful capabilities. It's created huge headaches for US military planners in the Indo-Pacific. It's also, though, perhaps been a victim of its own success, because China's conventional missile capabilities were one of the reasons why the United States was not perhaps as keen to preserve the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with the Russians that would have constrained it from deploying similar types of systems. When it comes to offensive cyber operations, I think this is one of the most uncertain pillars of China's strategic substitution. If one looks at US discussions about whether large-scale offensive cyber operations can generate coercive leverage, generally speaking, US scholars and decision makers seem to think that the strategic effects of cyber operations are really lying below the level of the threshold of armed conflict in a kind of cumulative impact of lots of smaller scale cyber operations, not what the PLA is talking about. So I have Viasat up here on the slide in part because one of the things I'm attuned to now, having been to China, collected some new materials, listened to conversations in China, is that the People's Liberation Army is perhaps questioning just how much coercive utility they can get out of cyber operations because they've watched what's happened in Ukraine and perhaps have been a little disappointed by the impact of offensive cyber operations. At the same time, though, we have a very serious set of widespread intrusions by Chinese actors into US critical infrastructure to pre-place malware with the Volt Typhoon attacks that's very much in line with Chinese kind of thinking about how you would use offensive cyber operations for coercive leverage. So we've got kind of both going on there. Finally, in the space piece, the United States has stood up a space force. It's changed the way that it architected its own satellite constellations, in part in response to its adversaries, including China's development of counter-space weapons. But again, China might find that it's much more difficult to use these capabilities in a conflict for leverage because it is now facing these inadvertent nuclear escalation issues more seriously, especially as it starts to put more of its own early warning satellites up that support its nuclear capabilities. So I can go into implications or we can go into Q&A. It's very much up to you, but
just do one slide on implications.
One slide on implications. I'll point to three. The first thing that I think, and this leads to, I think, Evan's introduction about China's nuclear capabilities, is that strategic substitution helps us to better understand what might be going on with China's nuclear modernization. It's another, China's level of confidence with this option of strategic substitution is a kind of barometer of how attractive it might think the option of threatening nuclear first use is. So if China's confidence in strategic substitution has tanked, then the nuclear option might look a lot more attractive to China, even if it's not very credible, because it simply doesn't have the decisive conventional capabilities at the moment to threaten victory across the Taiwan Strait in a conventional war with the US. The second implication I'll point out is that strategic substitution has kind of an uncertain future. Its durability depends on how the United States' countermeasures diminish the effectiveness of China's efforts to use these capabilities for leverage, but also China's own learning about the utility of these capabilities. Finally, I'll try and end on an optimistic note here, which is obviously this creates challenges for doing risk reduction, especially in the nuclear space. It means that if the US and China are talking about nuclear risks, they can't ignore all of these other information age capabilities that are going to generate nuclear risk, even if the two countries can kind of talk through the nuclear issues. But the inverse is also true. If China and the US have difficulty talking about nuclear risks, then other inroads into managing the risks of strategic weapons use and the kind of major damage that could occur from a large-scale war between the two countries, one can get at that risk through talking about cyber capabilities or space capabilities, as well as nuclear, if the nuclear talks are deadlocked or on the hold as they currently are. So I'll pause there. If you're interested, pre-order the book. It's coming out on...
When can we get it, Fiona?
It is coming out on January the 7th of 2025, and you can order it from Amazon or from the Princeton website. And if you want to know more about my other research, then there's my website.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask the first question and then open it up to the audience. So Fiona, first question, obvious question, I'm sure it's one that you've thought about and are well prepared for, is since you started this research, one of the biggest changes in the status quo is the expansion of the Chinese nuclear arsenal.
Yep.
You know, it probably started at somewhere around 300 warheads, and maybe going up to 1,000, some estimates say even 1,500. So that obviously has significant implications for your research, because either that means the Chinese never pursued strategic substitution, there were other reasons, or they tried it and said, yep, that doesn't really solve our problem, or there's actually parallel logics going on. They want both, you know, a range of capabilities below the level of nuclear weapons, and they want nuclear weapons as well. So what's your sense of why China's going big and what it means for your argument?
Sure. So I think there's two possibilities, and it is the last two. I'm quite persuaded, and you can come to your own conclusions after reading the book, but I'm quite persuaded that up until about 2019 or so, China really wasn't looking seriously at nuclear first use as its option for dealing with the limited war dilemma. These statements about the lack of credibility of making nuclear threats against an adversary like the US are pretty persuasive, and they're coming from quite high levels. I think what happens, so to me, I think the modernization signs really begin to emerge in 2019. So you can imagine that the decisions are taking place in a couple of years before then, or some have argued there's a kind of longer slide towards this modernization. And I think there's really two plausible explanations so far as this research is concerned. One is China starts worrying that strategic substitution is kind of a bit shaky. And that's that sort of last piece that I mentioned. If you're worrying, no one's really deterred by cyber attacks. CounterSpace is kind of hard to use, and it's not distinguishable from using nuclear weapons anyway, because the US has been clear about retaliating with nuclear weapons. And precision conventional missiles, like they can put some holes in a runway, but this is just, the US is much more resolved than these things suggest. And so we need something that's more credible. We need something that's better. And the only option in this instance is nuclear first use, because our conventional capabilities are just not up to scratch yet. So that's option number one, which means that watching these assessments of the credibility of these substitutes is just as useful an indicator in some ways as looking at what China's talking about when it comes to its nuclear capabilities. And I'll just pause to say that I think studying what China's thinking about its nuclear capabilities right now is very difficult. That's one of the areas where I think the access to information that I had when I was doing my fieldwork is different. And that's in part because the levels of information circulating within China writ large have also become much more constrained. So people there have less of an idea what's going on. The other option is that there's parallel logics, and I think this is perhaps the, in some ways, what I think I would sort of tend is closest to the reason why China is building up its nuclear capabilities. That this is primarily about competition within the nuclear domain, and it's about a couple of things. So I've been researching this question of the modernization, so I can share a little bit about that other research that's not in the book. I think that there are, for an expansion of the size or a change of the magnitude of China's nuclear modernization, you need to get a couple of different constituencies on board. You need the top leaders' support. There's just no way that this could happen if Xi Jinping himself had not signed off on it. You need the military, you need the nuclear weapons kind of community and arms control labs, and you probably need some sort of broader defense public support in some ways. And different arguments, I think, persuade different parts of that set of constituencies to support the modernization. So, for example, there is plenty of evidence out there that China is concerned about US counterforce capabilities, missile defense, conventional strike that could destroy its nuclear weapons, as well as improving sensing capabilities that help the US to find China's nuclear weapons, destroy them before they're launched. That argument is really going to resonate with the arms control community that's always been very supportive of trying to burnish China's retaliatory capabilities, but not a lot more than that. I think for the broader sort of defense community, There is some evidence emerging that they see a larger nuclear arsenal as sort of imposing a degree of restraint on US decision makers such that they don't behave capriciously in Taiwan Strait contingencies. So it's not really linking the size of the nuclear arsenal to specific types of military contingencies or exchange rates and survivability, but it's more of a sort of psychological fact of having more is going to lead the US to behave.
If they have 5, we have 5, because if we have 4,
we've got less.
We've got less, and that might mean we're vulnerable to coercion.
And that also might mean the US thinks we're vulnerable to coercion,
right.
And the US is going to go ahead and try it out. So, I mean, for nuclear strategists,
Do we know, what's your best guess on what's motivating them? Because there's also this notion of pride and prestige, right? I know you're familiar with the Chinese scholar Tong Zhao, who makes this argument.
Yep. So I think that, Tong Zhao just released a terrific report, I think, on the Chinese nuclear modernization in which he talks about political drivers. And so the political drivers he's talking about are accelerating a US-China power transition and ensuring that China can get the US to accept its rise, not just in the military domain and in things like a Taiwan contingency, but also in non-nuclear domains like sanctions and other sort of aspects of Chinese power. So my research has suggested a slightly more constrained view of political leverage that's more targeted on Taiwan contingencies. But I think, the arguments that are likely to persuade the top leader may come to things like prestige, burnishing his historical legacy.
Big powers do.
Exactly. And so you don't have any one of those arguments that could carry the day with the modernization on its own, but probably all 3 of them convincing different stakeholders that there's something for them to support this change. One of the concerns, though, I think that I have at this point is that if you're increasing the size of your nuclear arsenal for reasons that have to do with, I have 5,000, you have 5,000. I'm inflating the numbers here, but that means we're equivalent, and you won't think that you can push me around. You still have to work out what you do with a much larger nuclear arsenal. And if it's not being driven by contingencies like, what China needs to do to augment its retaliatory capabilities, then you give a lot more leeway to, the rocket forces that for a long time has wanted a much more flexible
So how big do you
force.
think the Chinese nuclear force is going to get?
That is now you're putting me in a tricky position to hazard a guess. I would say,
do you take seriously the concern that they want to reach parity with the United States, for example?
I think that depends very much on what the US does with its own nuclear
Well, the U.S.
arsenal.
currently is, under the New START agreement, is locked in, I believe, until 2016 to 1,500 deployed warheads. So let's just say, for argument's sake,
Let's call that parity, because the US also has a stockpile. And so parity could be either of one of those 2 things, right? And I think Chinese strategists right now are looking at the stockpile plus the deployed numbers, not necessarily because I think that they're concerned that, or they're looking to say parity is more than what we used to say it is, but also because they're anticipating changes in US postures going forward. But if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that it's probably China's ambitions at this particular point in time probably sit somewhere a little bit under 1,000 warheads, but I think that they're going to really feel their way forward and see how the US reacts, how the political situation looks between the United States and China, but also looking at how everyone else around them reacts, because China has other nuclear adversaries, and it also has other countries on its periphery, and it has an audience that it very much cares about in the global south that may put pressure on China not to expand its nuclear arsenal more, or to come up with a good justification for it.
Yeah. Good. Okay, we got about 25 minutes for Q&A. Fiona, would you like me to field them, or would you like to?
I'm happy to field them. Okay, I'm going to go with this gentleman in the front.
And would you begin by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm really sorry. We're recording today's event, so please speak into the mic.
Thank you.
So first, I'm really appreciate your brilliant talk on the book, and really looking forward to it. Maybe I hope I could buy it when it's released. So I'm Jia Wei I'm from the history department. I'm a first-year master here, but I'm from China, and I'm very concerned about the Chinese military policies and future. So I actually have two questions for you. So first one is, what do you think about how do you classify the recent emerged hypersonic weapons, missiles that carried by the Chinese bombers and warships? And second is it's actually observation from two cases. First is after, I believe, 2014, Chinese Navy and Air Force have been explosively increased its power, but it was also, especially the rocket force, is still expanding the range and choices of missiles that expanded way beyond Taiwan Strait. It could reach as far as the Guam. And the second observation from the Russian-Ukrainian war, that both sides were using the short-range ballistic missiles to strike the time-sensitive targets. And I wonder that would you rather argue in the future ballistic missiles, essentially missiles for the Chinese air rocket force, is no longer a substitution, but rather a expanded strength to strengthen its conventional forces, especially during the A2AD operations to fight against American military bases and carrier fleets.
Mm-hmm. Good questions. Thank you for both. I'll start a little bit with the role of China's missile force in essentially what are like warfighting operations. It's a denial operation is the kind of intended application as part of A2AD. And the PLA writings make it pretty clear that that conventional missiles do play a role in things like the fire strike campaign, as well as anti-air raids. So campaigns that are basically designed for operational effects to keep a large adversary from engaging in air raids on the Chinese mainland, or alternatively to put pressure on or destroy strategic targets in advance of an island landing campaign, or for kind of punishment or coercive punishment sort of reasons. So there's already this sort of warfighting component to some of the short-range ballistic missiles in the PLA doctrine and writing. But I note that in some of the doctrinal writings, they will point to both China's conventional missiles as having a kind of fire strike mission where they're designed to basically inflict maximum damage on an adversary in assistance with it's sort of in furtherance of a conventional operation, or for strategic deterrence where it's going to be the top level leaders who'll be making decisions about how they'll be used. I think the constraint on China using them largely for warfighting is going to come from the command structure, because at this point in time, unlike for the Chinese Navy, Air Force, and ground forces, there is not a dual-hatted deputy commander in the theater commands for the rocket force. There is a liaison. And so that's going to limit the ability of a theater commander to actually be able to use those conventional missiles without getting kind of higher level approval, I assume, because the theater command itself doesn't actually have someone within it that's going to be able to command the conventional missile forces. So that if that changes, if you start to see that there's a rocket force commander sitting in the theater commands, that might signal exactly what you're talking about, that these capabilities are transitioning into a largely warfighting role. I would note, on the other hand, though, that China is also, there was some discussion in the latest Pentagon report about China developing a conventional intercontinental range ballistic missile. It's something that China's written about in sources from 20 years ago, but never acted on. And so it would be hard for me to imagine that a conventionally tipped intercontinental range ballistic missile would have a kind of warfighting role. That looks very much more like a limited number strategic capability that's designed to scare your opponent. On the hypersonics, I'll just say very quickly, I treat them as part of the conventional missile force posture, which is why it's the DF-17s that are on the cover of the book. Initially, I should say that there was going to be a nuclear weapon on the cover of the book, but we were very fortunate, and Princeton University Press's designers were exceptionally talented in finding pretty much exactly the same image, but with with a conventional capability, and intended to be used in pretty similar ways, but will be able to evade defences. And there's obviously, as you're probably aware, talk of expanding the range of the hypersonic ground-based missile force with the DF-27, so it will also have this defence evading sort of capacity. So you can look at this as an action-reaction in the kind of pure technology sense between the United States and China, as one develops better defences and the other develops capabilities that will continue to give you leverage and evade those defences.
Thank you.
Eric.
Hey Fiona, good to see you. Eric Gomez from the Cato Institute. You already knew that, but just for the audience. So in this, a lot of discourse in the United States about the Chinese nuclear buildup and what it means. I'm curious, is based off of all the research you've done into it, especially on the Chinese primary source side, what is the sort of biggest, you think, like misperception or mistake that the U.S. government is making when it analyzes the causes or the drivers of Chinese nuclear modernization activities, and why do you think that misperception is being made? Like, do you think that there's some kind of risk of, say Stratcom or someone else running with like they're doing it for X reason when really it's like Y reason or something like that?
It's a good question. I think that I would probably say it's less of a misperception and more of a mistake would be too strong a word, but I think other choices would perhaps be preferable. So I think that the biggest issue that the US government is making with regards to its policy making in response to China's nuclear capabilities is to make assumptions about the worst case scenario, that China could be pursuing parity and that could be pursuing superiority. It could be pursuing counterforce capabilities, especially on the basis of the missile silos. And I think that making decisions on the basis of the worst case scenario could actually could encourage China to adopt more of those kinds of policies and actually build up its nuclear forces to a greater extent than is possible. I think the reason why those choices are being made, though, is that the US government, like a lot of scholars, just doesn't have any other information to go off to suggest anything else. And so I think in many cases the onus is on our Chinese counterparts to offer a little bit more reassurance, because there's a closing window before some of those worst case scenario planning assumptions are implemented into decisions that will be very hard to reverse.
Questions?
I have a question. My name is Daniel. Hi, my name is Daniel. I was also a student in the Asian Studies program here at Georgetown, most recently at Taizhou Future Consensus Institute. My question, so in your chapter on China's space CounterSpace capabilities, you said that there's a glimmer of hope because there's a recognition, especially early on, that there's very specific, very significant escalation dynamics that could rise to the nuclear threshold. Do you think that that is an important takeaway for U.S. administration efforts to come to a degree of agreement with China on an arms control agreement or a dialogue on rules of the road, principles for behavior in space?
So I would go more with the latter. I think that there's more, I think that, I will just say straight up that I think that arms control in space has always been a very, very difficult issue. It's one of the areas that is sort of overlooked as an area where there were shortcomings in US Soviet or US Russian progress at the end of the Cold War, that there were not more arms control agreements that came out in that instance. So I think writ large arms control in a formal sense in space is quite difficult. But I think the real place where there is room for discussion is between US and Chinese counterparts about what certain types of behavior mean, traffic deconfliction. So there are kind of couple of just, behavior.
In space.
In space, yes, yeah. So, how do you work out where your things are going and my things are going, that they're not going to collide with each other? I think one of the other areas where there's room for kind of better mutual understanding from dialogue, rules of the road, has to do with understanding the role of commercial space, because a lot of the Chinese writings that I have reviewed suggest that China does not actually see commercial space capabilities in the United States, such as Elon Musk's Starlink constellation, as being distinctive from the US government. They sort of see these two things as together, and that's a mirror imaging issue for China, because within China, firms and the government, especially those that are working in space, are not necessarily as separate. So that's an area, I think, where there's room for kind of clarifying misperceptions on the sort of space piece.
Do you think there's more prospect for arms control in space than arms control on nuclear weapons now? Is that what you're saying, Fiona?
I think at this particular point in time in the US-China relationship, I would probably, if I were to put my eggs in one basket, I would be putting them in risk reduction measures in space and in cyberspace, because there are already very active efforts by China to engage on multilateral risk reduction in the United Nations. So there's fora in which you can have some of those discussions.
But of course their capabilities in both of those areas are also growing, modernizing, expanding.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a lot of value to having those kinds of discussions. But for whatever reason, US-China nuclear risk reduction discussions are in a freeze at the moment. So there was a set of discussions between the United States and China about nuclear arms control in November of last year. And any further discussion between the two countries was cut off earlier this year, ostensibly because of US arms sales to Taiwan. And my read from sort of looking at that is China tends to sort of cut off the dialogues that it sees as the least useful, if you like, in the relationship. And so that tells you something about how useful China thinks that a nuclear risk reduction.
Or at least the least useful for China.
For China, yes, yeah. Different story perhaps for others, but in their estimation is the least sort of valuable in terms of altering things in the relationship to risks that they're concerned about. So I would sort of see if that channel is in a difficult place and opportunities do come around to sort of push forward on the nuclear discussion piece, that one could also have quite fruitful discussions on space, and including China standing up an early warning capability for its nuclear capabilities. There's, I think, room to have joint studies or other types of activities that might raise awareness of the types of risks, accidents, and mistakes that have happened in the past.
But of course, the US and the Soviets didn't have any of those kinds of conversations until the mid-1960s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you see any evidence, either in writings or writings by PLA officers or others in China, of an actual interest by the Chinese officials in arms control?
I think depends a little bit on where you look. I think that Chinese arms control experts do recognize that there's certainly value in Track 2 discussions.
So the arms controllers in China support arms control?
Support arms, perhaps unsurprisingly,
right.
support arms control. No surprises maybe in that instance. But I think that the priority for China at this point in time really is the political relationship and improving the political relationship. And that is perhaps the difference between the United States and Soviet Union / Russia and China, is that for China the priority really is stability at the political level, respect for core interests ahead of managing nuclear risks. And there is a sort of transactional nature sometimes to China's bargaining on these matters, that discussing nuclear risks is seen as something that's more of concern to the US than to China. So you'll engage in a discussion over that when the relationship is good, but it's not really sort of substantively doing things from the PRC side that's helpful.
Performative, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe one more question.
Good afternoon, Ms. Cunningham. Thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. Looking forward to reading the book. I'm Pavlo Zvonogorodsky, Georgetown University. And I have a question about So you very briefly touched on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how China is learning from what conventional capabilities Russia uses in this war. But what potential do you think China sees in its deepening ties with Russia when it comes to learning from Russia and enhancing its conventional capabilities, be it conventional missiles or maybe some other types of conventional weapons? Thank you.
So again, tricky question. I'm afraid to say there's not a ton in the book except for the lessons that I'm sort of speculating that China could draw from the Russian invasion of Ukraine for its thinking about and its confidence in these three information age capabilities, but also on the efficacy of nuclear threats. But I think there are two other ways in which the Russia-China partnership could also influence China's thinking about its, let's say, non-nuclear capabilities. One is in technology transfer and the other is joint exercises. So have been a number of joint exercises between Russia and China recently, including bomber flights close to the United States. And for China, these offer sort of opportunities when it has a relatively nascent bomber capability to learn how a country that's been doing this kind of thing for a long time might go about doing it. So I see that's one area where you might see that partnership assisting. Another area is technology transfer, and I think there's been some discussion about submarine quietening, about missile early warning. Again, these are coming from US intelligence reports, so there's not a ton of detail of exactly what's going on there, but they're also, relevant to especially China's nuclear capabilities if you're looking at quieter submarines, but also quieter attack submarines, and also relevant to how you actually construct and run an early warning system, whether you then plan to engage in launch under attack for your nuclear weapons as well. On the lessons of the war in Ukraine more broadly, I touched on the cyber ones because I actually do think they're quite significant in raising questions for the PLA about whether this capability would be effective. And there's writings sort of suggesting, well, there's a number of reasons why, cyber attacks didn't do much for Russia.
Well, Russia didn't use a lot of them, especially at the beginning, right?
I think it used quite a lot and then tailed off quite quickly. But we're targeting financial institutions, command and control, government bureaucracies. But according to the PLA analysts, it could be that Ukrainian defenders were great. That they were heavily assisted by the United States and private tech companies, but also that Russia may have been keeping its powder dry because it had other objectives that it needed to engage in cyber operations for, and also that it's just hard to coordinate attacks in cyberspace with physical attacks. Like, it's just a difficult thing to do. So there's a couple of reasons that they're looking at that don't, immediately invalidate the role of cyber operations, but sort of call into question. One could say similar things about the conventional missile forces, where the Russians have used those perhaps to varying levels of effectiveness, even in their sort of reliability as missiles themselves. But I think in the space piece, like, the attention for China is really laser focused, pardon the pun, on Starlink and on what proliferated, so these large constellations are going to mean for things like, if you want to put up space-based interceptors and resurrect the Strategic Defense Initiative. This is one of the sort of conversations that's happening in China, is sort of like, if you can do this, what does this mean for other types of space activities? And just to be clear, Starlink can't do space-based interceptors for missile defense. But so it's more on sort of the support architecture than the CounterSpace piece. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of texture on how I see that relationship affecting some of the things that I talked about.
Great. Okay, final question for me. So Fiona, if you had to draw parallels between the U.S.-China nuclear dynamic today and the U.S.-Soviet dynamic in the 1950s, what would you look to, or is it just a bad analogy?
In the 50s?
50s.
I don't think it's a bad analogy, but I think it is one where we have seen the movie before. That's how I would put it. So
who's we in that sentence?
China, the United States, Russia, interested countries sort of in the place.
That doesn't mean the movie can't be replayed.
It certainly does not. It certainly does not.
That's essentially my question. Do you think the U.S. and China are sort of backing into the same dynamic that the U.S. and the Russians had in the 1950s, an emerging nuclear competition?
I think it is a possibility, and I think that the possibility of that emerging lie very much in the choices that China makes going forward with regard to its expanding nuclear arsenal and who is going to win bureaucratic arguments within China and how it's going to allocate resources to nuclear versus other capabilities. And to be fair, that's a similar conversation that, putting on my hat as a citizen of a US ally, this is another conversation that I think the US also needs to be having about where you put resources in conventional versus nuclear capabilities to deal with this ongoing strategic competition. The big difference, I would say, between the US, China, and US Soviet dynamic, though, is that today's East Asia is not yesterday's Central Front in Europe. This is a very different operational context. It is a very different geographical context, and those influence the way in which any conflict would take place in that domain in ways that make certain types of nuclear weapons that are designed to, just defend your borders far less useful in the US-China context today. But they also highlight the fact that...
But in both theaters, Europe in the 50s, Asia today, you had one central conflict.
Yeah.
Germany in the 50s, Taiwan today.
Taiwan today, North Korea is also a potential superpower contingency, as are the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea, which are not necessarily connected to nuclear dynamics, but that shadow is somewhere way off in the background anyway, because some of those territorial disputes were involving US allies who receive extended deterrence. But I think the big thing to point out for me here is that these conflicts don't immediately involve existential risks to China's survival or to the United States' survival. And that, I think, is the difference between...
So you don't think the Chinese see Taiwan as existential to their survival?
I think China sees... I think that China... So I'll back up for a second. China has been able to exist with the status quo in Taiwan for quite a long time at this point, right? So we're about 75...
Since 1949.
Yeah, so 75 years.
Yep.
And so whatever is currently going on clearly is not an urgent threat to the survival of the PRC as an entity or the Communist Party's continuing survival. The question is what would happen in a conflict, and I think opinions differ on this issue. But China as a political entity, putting aside the party, like that landmass can continue without having direct political control over the island of Taiwan. But I think that there are different views as to what would happen if there was a conflict, and what the risks would be to continued party rule if it were to look like China was not succeeding in a conventional war that would enable it to consolidate control over Taiwan. For my 2 cents worth, I don't necessarily think that nuclear weapons are going to solve that problem, because there's a very indirect chain between something like threatening the use of nuclear weapons to change the nature of a conventional conflict outcome to resolve what would essentially be internal threats to party control within China from, either elite contestation or from a public uprising. There are a whole lot of other tools that the Chinese Communist Party has at its disposal to deal with issues either within the party or with the public. And if you start lobbing nuclear weapons at the United States, it's pretty hard to, unless you're very sure the US is going to stand down, then you may be gambling with more than saying that you won the conflict and you'll live to fight another day would. Yeah. So that's my 2 cents worth, but I know that reasonable opinions on this existential risk differ.
Yeah. Well, everybody, please join me in thanking Fiona for a wonderful presentation.